The year is 1982, and the cold, grey waters of the South Atlantic have just delivered a terrifying wake-up call to the naval powers of the world. In the Falklands War, a handful of sea-skimming Exocet missiles, fired by Argentine jets, managed to bypass the defences of the Royal Navy, crippling modern warships and proving that in the late 20th century, the anti-ship missile was the undisputed king of naval combat. But for the admirals sitting in the Pentagon, the Falklands was just a minor skirmish compared to the nightmare scenario they planned for every single day. What if the target was not a British destroyer, but a 100,000-ton American supercarrier? And what if the attacker was not a cash-strapped South American Air Force, but the full, terrifying might of the Soviet Union? Specifically, what would happen if a United States Navy carrier strike group, operating at the absolute edge of its tether in the eastern Mediterranean, or pushing into the hostile bathtub of the Black Sea, went head-to-head with the Soviet Black Sea Fleet and its land-based naval aviation? Welcome back to the channel, where we strip away the political rhetoric and analyze the hard steel, the logistics, and the brutal tactical realities of modern warfare. If you want to understand how the United States military actually fights and dominates on the global stage, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community of veterans, strategists, and history buffs. To understand the sheer scale of violence that would unfold in a 1982 clash between the US Navy and the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, we have to strip away the myth and look at the brutal geography of the region. The Black Sea is essentially a massive landlocked maritime trap, roughly the size of California, connected to the open oceans by a single highly vulnerable choke point known as the Turkish Straits, comprising the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. For centuries, going all the way back to Catherine the Great, the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union obsessed over this body of water. It was their primary warm water access point, the springboard from which they projected power into the Mediterranean and the Middle East. But the Soviets knew that in the event of a Third World War, the United States and its NATO ally Turkey would instantly slam that door shut. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet was therefore built with a schizophrenic mission profile. First, it had to dominate the Black Sea itself, turning it into a heavily defended bastion to protect the southern flank of the Warsaw Pact. Second, it had to break out through the Straits, punch its way into the eastern Mediterranean, and hunt down the United States Sixth Fleet before American carrier-based aircraft could launch nuclear strikes against the Soviet motherland. This strategic dynamic creates a fascinating parallel to the Pacific theater of World War II. Just as the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1944 relied on a complex, synchronized doctrine of land-based bombers and surface fleets to try and destroy American carriers in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Soviets built their entire naval architecture around the concept of the massive, coordinated missile salvo. But unlike the vast, open expanses of the Pacific, the eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea are incredibly confined, cluttered with islands, commercial shipping, and shallow waters. Fighting a naval battle here is less like the open ocean duels of Midway and more like the brutal knife-fight ranges of Iron Bottom Sound during the Guadalcanal campaign, but scaled up to an era where weapons travel at Mach 4 and carry nuclear warheads. So how does a commander position a multi-billion-dollar carrier strike group in such a constrained environment? You do not hide. You project an overwhelming, impenetrable bubble of American firepower. By 1982, the United States Navy was undergoing a massive renaissance under the Reagan administration, pushing toward the goal of a 600-ship navy. At the center of this maritime dominance was the Nimitz-class supercarrier, And for this scenario, we will look at the USS Nimitz herself, CVN-68. Displacing over 90,000 tons and stretching over 1,000 feet in length, the Nimitz was not just a ship. She was 4.5 acres of sovereign, heavily armored American territory, powered by two A4W nuclear reactors that gave her unlimited range and the ability to sprint at over 30 knots indefinitely. But the carrier itself is just a floating airfield. The true striking power lay in Carrier Air Wing 8, parked on her flight deck. In 1982, the undisputed apex predator of fleet defense was the Grumman F-14A Tomcat. The Tomcat was not designed to be a nimble dogfighter, although it could hold its own. It was designed specifically to kill Soviet bombers before they could launch their anti-ship missiles. At the heart of the Tomcat was the Hughes AWG-9 radar system, a piece of engineering so advanced that it could track 24 airborne targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 120 miles and guide missiles to 6 of them at the exact same time. The weapon paired with this radar was the AIM-54 Phoenix missile. Weighing over 1,000 pounds and carrying a 135-pound fragmentation warhead, the Phoenix would climb to 80,000 feet, accelerate to Mach 5, and dive onto its target from above. No other navy on Earth possessed an interceptor with this kind of reach or lethality. Complementing the Tomcats were the A-6E Intruders, the heavy haulers of the air wing, capable of delivering immense payloads of unguided Mark 82 bombs, Hawkeye cluster munitions, and early Harpoon anti-ship missiles in zero-visibility weather or at dead of night. To blind the enemy, the air wing relied on the EA-6B Prowler, an electronic warfare aircraft that could fry Soviet radar screens with high-powered jamming, turning the tactical picture into a snowstorm of false returns. Protecting the carrier from surface and subsurface threats was a screen of escorts that formed the carrier strike group. While the revolutionary Aegis combat system was just entering service and not yet fully deployed across the fleet in 1982, the US Navy relied on highly capable nuclear-powered cruisers like the Virginia-class, armed with twin-arm launchers for the Standard Missile-1, providing a robust medium-range air defense umbrella. For anti-submarine warfare, the Spruance-class destroyers were the silent hunters of the fleet. Powered by 4 General Electric LM2500 gas turbines, the Spruance was incredibly quiet, equipped with the SQS-53 bow sonar and trailing a massive tactical towed array sonar behind it to listen for the faint acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines. Lurking beneath the entire formation would be 1 or 2 Los Angeles-class nuclear fast-attack submarines, acting as the vanguard to clear the ocean depths. And tying this all together was the unparalleled American logistics train. Unlike the Soviet Navy, which struggled with underway replenishment and often had to return to port to rearm, the US Navy utilized massive Sacramento-class fast combat support ships. These floating warehouses could steam alongside the carrier at 26 knots, transferring thousands of gallons of JP-5 jet fuel, tons of ordnance, and dry provisions via highline rigs, allowing the strike group to remain on station and combat effective for months at a time. Against this floating fortress stood the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, commanded in 1982 by Admiral Nikolai Khovrin. The Soviet naval doctrine was entirely different from the American approach. They did not build supercarriers, they built ship killers. The Soviet strategy was known as the Battle of the First Salvo. They believed that a war against a US carrier group would be decided in the first few minutes of combat. Their goal was to launch a massive, coordinated strike of anti-ship missiles from submarines, surface ships and aircraft simultaneously overwhelming the American air defenses through sheer volume and speed. In 1982, the pride of the Black Sea Fleet Surface Force was the brand-new Project 1164 Atlant-class cruiser, known to the West as the Slava-class. The lead ship, Slava, which would decades later be renamed Moskva, was essentially a floating missile battery. Lining her port and starboard sides were 16 massive launch tubes for the P-500 Bazalt anti-ship missile. The Bazalt was a monster. Weighing over 10,000 pounds, it flew at Mach 2.5 and carried a 2,000-pound high-explosive warhead or a 350-kiloton nuclear payload. The Soviets designed the Bazalt to be fired in a synchronized swarm. One missile in the flight would pop up to a higher altitude, acting as a spotter to acquire the American carrier with its active radar, and then data link the targeting information to the other missiles, skimming just above the wave tops. If the spotter missile was shot down by a Tomcat or a standard missile, another Bazalt would automatically pop up to take its place. Supporting the Slava were older but still deadly Kara-class and Kinder-class cruisers, armed with varying types of anti-ship and anti-submarine weaponry. Beneath the surface, the Black Sea Fleet deployed a large number of diesel-electric submarines, primarily the Project 641 Foxtrot and the newer Project 641B Tango classes. While they lacked the unlimited endurance of American nuclear submarines, in the confined, shallow and acoustically messy waters of the Black Sea and the Aegean, a battery-powered Tango sitting silently on the bottom, waiting in ambush, with 53-centimeter wake-homing torpedoes, was a lethal threat. But the surface ships and submarines were only the anvil. The hammer of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet belonged to Soviet naval aviation, specifically the 2nd Guards Maritime Missile Aviation Division based in the Crimea. Their primary weapon delivery system was the Tupolev Tu-22M Backfire bomber. The Backfire was a swing-wing supersonic bomber designed with one singular purpose: to hunt and sink American aircraft carriers. A regiment of Backfires would launch from their bases, flying at low altitudes over the Black Sea to avoid early radar detection, before popping up to launch their ordnance. The weapon they carried was the Kh-22, known to NATO as the AS-4 Kitchen. The Kitchen was not a precision instrument. It was a brute force sledgehammer. Powered by a liquid-fuel rocket engine, the missile would climb to an altitude of nearly 90,000 feet, accelerate to an astonishing Mach 4.6, and then plunge into a steep terminal dive toward the American fleet. At that speed, the kinetic energy alone of the missile striking a ship would be enough to break the keel of a cruiser, even before the 2,000-pound shaped charge warhead detonated. How does a fleet defend against a weapon moving at over 3,000 miles per hour, when the radar horizon of a surface ship is only about 20 miles away? This is the exact problem that drove the creation of the Aegis system. But in 1982, the defense relied entirely on the E-2C Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft and the F-14 Tomcats pushing the defensive perimeter hundreds of miles away from the carrier. The American tactical doctrine, known as the Composite Warfare Commander concept, decentralized decision-making. The Admiral aboard the carrier delegated specific defensive warfare areas to subordinate commanders, allowing the strike group to react instantly to threats without waiting for orders from the top. If a Soviet backfire regiment was detected, the air warfare commander, usually the captain of a guided missile cruiser, had the authority to immediately vector every available Tomcat to intercept. Contrast this with the Soviet command structure, which was rigidly top-down. The coordination of a multi-axis strike involving backfire bombers, Slava cruisers, and submarines required immense communication traffic and precise timing, all orchestrated from a shore-based headquarters. If the Americans could disrupt those communication links using the EA-6B Prowlers, or if they could shoot down the Soviet Tu-95 Bear maritime patrol aircraft that provided the initial targeting data, the entire Soviet synchronized strike could fall apart, leaving their assets to attack piecemeal. This brings us to a critical historical parallel. During the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, the US Navy faced the ultimate saturation attack in the form of Japanese kamikazes. The fleet survived, not by hiding, but by establishing distant radar picket lines, deploying massive combat air patrols, and utilizing the proximity fuse to create walls of flak. In 1982, the technology had changed to AWG-9 radars, Phoenix missiles, and radar-guided Gatling guns, like the Phalanx CIWS. But the fundamental American tactical DNA remained exactly the same. Push the defense out as far as possible, kill the archer before he can release his arrows, and absorb whatever leaks through with superior damage control and layered defense. The industrial and technological disparity between the two superpowers in 1982 also heavily favored the United States. While the Soviets built terrifying hyperfast missiles, their electronics, radar seekers, and target discrimination capabilities were generations behind American solid-state electronics. A Soviet Kh-22 missile, diving at Mach 4.6, had a relatively primitive radar seeker that was highly susceptible to the advanced electronic countermeasures deployed by American ships. Furthermore, the American Defense Industrial Base ensured that a deployed carrier strike group had a deep magazine of highly reliable interceptors, whereas the Soviet fleet often struggled with maintenance readiness and the logistical nightmare of reloading massive anti-ship missiles at sea. So, we have the pieces on the board. A United States Navy carrier strike group built around the USS Nimitz, representing the pinnacle of flexible, decentralized, and technologically superior maritime power, operating in the constrained waters of the eastern Mediterranean. Opposing them is the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, a force built entirely around the rigid, top-down doctrine of the massive, overwhelming first strike, armed with supersonic ship killers and backed by regiments of backfire bombers operating from their home turf in the Crimea. The political tensions have boiled over, the diplomatic channels have gone dark, and the rules of engagement have shifted from peacetime posturing to weapons-free. The E-2C Hawkeye, circling at 30,000 feet above the Aegean, has just detected multiple supersonic contacts lifting off from runways in the Crimean Peninsula, while the sonar operators aboard the Spruance destroyers are picking up the unmistakable acoustic signatures of torpedo tube doors opening in the dark waters below. The battle space is set, the geometry of the engagement is locked in, and the battle of the first salvo is about to begin. Inside the cramped, windowless Combat Information Center of the E-2C Hawkeye, orbiting at 30,000 feet above the Aegean, the radar scopes suddenly bloom with hostile tracks. Over 100 supersonic bogies are lifting off from the Crimean Peninsula, forming into regiment-sized attack wedges and pushing south toward the Mediterranean. Simultaneously, the passive sonar arrays trailing behind the American Spruance-class destroyers register the faint mechanical whine of torpedo tube doors opening in the cold depths below. The data link instantly feeds this nightmare scenario directly into the Combat Direction Center of the USS Nimitz. There is no panic, no waiting for a committee in Washington to approve a response, because the American Composite Warfare Commander Doctrine is built for this exact fraction of a second. The tactical action officer aboard the carrier simply keys his microphone and declares, "Warning Red, weapons free." High above the fleet, 24 F-14A Tomcats, already flying combat air patrol, slam their throttles into Zone 5 afterburner. The Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engines guzzle JP-5 jet fuel, kicking the 60,000-pound interceptors past the sound barrier in a matter of seconds. The geometry of the intercept is a brutal math equation. The Soviet Tu-22M Backfire bombers are trying to reach their launch points roughly 200 miles from the carrier group, while the Tomcats are racing forward to push that launch line as far back as physically possible. In the back seat of the F-14s, the radar intercept officers go to work with the AWG-9 radar, a system so powerful it literally burns through the Soviet electronic jamming radiating from their escort aircraft. At a range of 100 miles, the American crews achieve weapons lock and ripple fire their AIM-54 Phoenix missiles. How do you stop a massive coordinated bomber strike before it can even see its target? You hit them with a weapon they cannot outrun and cannot outmaneuver. The Phoenix missile drops from the belly of the Tomcat, its solid rocket motor igniting and propelling the 1,000-pound weapon into a steep climb toward the stratosphere. Reaching 80,000 feet, the missiles pitch over and accelerate to Mach 5, plunging down on the Soviet formations like a volley of hypersonic spears. Inside the Soviet backfires, the radar warning receivers suddenly scream as the active seekers on the Phoenix missiles go pitbull, turning on their own radars for the terminal intercept. The heavy, fully loaded Soviet bombers attempt to break lock, banking hard into evasive maneuvers, but you cannot outturn a missile moving at nearly 4,000 miles per hour. The 135-pound continuous rod warheads detonate in a lethal radius, instantly shredding aluminum airframes, igniting fuel tanks, and blowing the wings off the lead bombers. Because the Soviet doctrine relies on a rigid, top-down command structure, the sudden annihilation of their flight leaders throws the trailing squadrons into absolute chaos. Without their commanders to coordinate the synchronized launch, the surviving backfire pilots panic and release their Kh-22 anti-ship missiles early, firing blind into the electronic static generated by the American EA-6B Prowlers. But the Soviets built their doctrine on overwhelming volume, and despite the slaughter in the outer air battle, a dozen Kh-22 Kitchen missiles managed to break through, their liquid fuel rockets pushing them to Mach 4.6 as they dive toward the American carrier group. Now the battle shifts to the middle defense ring, commanded by the guided missile cruisers and destroyers screening the Nimitz. The USS Texas, a nuclear-powered Virginia-class cruiser, tracks the incoming vampires on its SPS-48 three-dimensional air search radar. The Mark 26 twin-arm launchers on the bow and stern slew wildly, hurling SM-1 medium-range surface-to-air missiles into the sky. The sky over the fleet is crisscrossed with the white contrails of interceptors and the fiery exhaust of incoming Soviet heavy metal. The SM-1s find their marks, swatting several Kitchen missiles out of the sky, but the kinetic energy of the interceptions is so immense that raining debris still crashes into the ocean like a meteor shower, sending geysers of water hundreds of feet into the air. 3 Soviet missiles managed to survive the gauntlet of Standard missiles and enter the inner defense zone. This is where the technological disparity between American solid-state electronics and Soviet vacuum tube technology becomes a fatal flaw for the attackers. The SLQ-32 electronic warfare suites on the American escorts detect the primitive active radar seekers of the incoming kitchens. Instantly, the automated defense systems fire Mark 36 SRBOC launchers, filling the airspace around the ships with massive blooming clouds of chaff, essentially millions of strips of aluminum foil cut to specific radar wavelengths. 2 of the Soviet missiles, confused by the massive radar returns of the chaff, break their lock on the ships and dive harmlessly into the decoy clouds, detonating violently against the empty ocean. The final missile, however, ignores the chaff and bears down on a Knox-class frigate on the outer picket line. At a range of 1 mile, the Phalanx close-in weapon system wakes up. The autonomous, radar-guided 20mm Gatling gun tracks the incoming threat and unleashes a solid wall of depleted uranium penetrators at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. The buzzsaw sound of the Phalanx echoes across the water as the stream of heavy metal intersects the missile just a few hundred yards from the ship, detonating the warhead in mid-air and peppering the frigate's superstructure with high-velocity shrapnel. Fires break out on the frigate's deck, and radar antennas are sheared off. But this brings us to a critical distinction between the two navies. Soviet ships were built as heavily armed glass cannons, packed with exposed ordnance and lacking robust damage control features. The United States Navy, however, forged its damage control doctrine in the infernos of World War II, learning from the survival of ships like the USS Franklin, which took devastating bomb hits but refused to sink. The damage control parties on the American frigate respond instantly, donning oxygen-breathing apparatuses, running fire hoses, and shoring up bulkheads with relentless, drilled precision. The fire is contained within minutes, the ship maintains engine power, and the frigate stays firmly in the fight, proving that American survivability is just as lethal a weapon as its firepower. While the sky is ablaze, an equally brutal knife fight is taking place beneath the waves. The acoustic environment of the eastern Mediterranean is a chaotic mess of thermal layers, salinity gradients, and shallow seabeds, creating perfect hiding spots for the Soviet diesel-electric Tango-class submarines. A Soviet captain, running silently on battery power, creeps his boat above the thermocline, preparing to unleash a spread of wake-homing torpedoes at the American carrier. But the US Navy has owned the anti-submarine warfare domain for decades. Lurking in the Deep Sound Channel, a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine, the USS Baton Rouge has been stalking the Soviet formation since they left the Dardanelles. Using its massive spherical bow sonar array, the Baton Rouge filters out the surface noise and isolates the faint, rhythmic cavitation of the Tango's propellers. The American captain does not wait to be fired upon. A Mark 48 wire-guided heavyweight torpedo is ejected from the torpedo tube with a burst of compressed air. The Mark 48 is an absolute monster, swimming at over 55 knots and trailing a thin copper wire that allows the submarine's fire control computer to guide it directly to the target. The Soviet sonar operator hears the high-speed screws of the incoming torpedo, and the captain orders an emergency blow, desperately trying to surface and evade. It is a futile gesture. The Mark 48 acquires the submarine with its own active sonar, pitches up, and detonates its 650-pound high-explosive warhead directly beneath the Tango's keel. The massive overpressure bubble snaps the Soviet submarine in half, sending it to the bottom of the sea before it ever had a chance to fire a single shot. With the backfire rage shattered and the submarine threat neutralized, the tactical reality of the battlefield shifts dramatically. The Soviet battle of the first salvo has failed. They threw their heaviest punch, and the American carrier strike group absorbed it, deflected it, and remained fully operational. Now, the United States Navy prepares to do what it does best: deliver a crushing, overwhelming counterpunch. Aboard the USS Nimitz, the flight deck is a choreographed ballet of controlled violence. Yellow-shirted directors guide heavily loaded A-6E Intruders and A-7E Corsairs onto the steam catapults. Red-shirted ordnancemen arm the weapons, pulling the safety pins on AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles and racks of Mark 82 laser-guided bombs. The catapults fire every 30 seconds, hurling fully loaded attack jets into the sky, assembling an Alpha Strike package designed to wipe the Soviet surface fleet off the map. The target is the Soviet flagship, the Slava-class cruiser, and its escorts, which are desperately trying to close the distance to fire their P-500 Bazalt missiles. The American strike package does not fly in high and proud. They come in on the deck. The A-6 Intruders drop to an altitude of 200 feet, using their terrain-following radars to skim the wave tops, masking their approach behind the curvature of the Earth and the scattered Greek islands. Above them, the EA-6B Prowlers open up with their ALQ-99 tactical jamming pods, flooding the Soviet surface search radars with megawatts of electronic noise. Inside the Combat Information Center of the Slava, the Soviet radar screens are completely whited out by static, rendering their long-range surface-to-air missiles useless. Why rely on a massive, unwieldy missile when you can deliver a precision strike right into the enemy's blind spot? At a range of 60 miles, the American Intruders pop up just high enough to acquire the Soviet cruiser on their attack radars and ripple-fire a swarm of Harpoon missiles. The Harpoons drop toward the water, engaging their sea-skimming altimeters, and fly at just 15 feet above the waves, completely invisible to the blinded Soviet radars until they are less than 10 miles away. The Soviet AK-630 close-in weapon systems finally detect the incoming threats and open fire. But without the closed-loop tracking precision of the American phalanx, their fire is erratic and inaccurate. 6 Harpoon missiles slam into the port side of the Slava cruiser in rapid succession. The armor-piercing warheads punch through the thin steel hull and detonate deep inside the ship's engineering spaces and magazines. The explosions sever the ship's power mains, plunging the cruiser into darkness, and the resulting fires instantly cook off the remaining P-500 Bazalt missiles sitting in their massive launch tubes on the main deck. The secondary explosions tear the superstructure apart, breaking the back of the flagship and sending the pride of the Black Sea Fleet to the bottom of the Mediterranean in a matter of minutes. This brutal counterattack echoes the historical lessons of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944. The Japanese center force believed they could overwhelm the American fleet with massive surface firepower, but they were systematically dismantled by relentless, coordinated American air power and aggressive small ship tactics. In 1982, the technology has evolved from Hellcat fighters to Harpoon-armed Intruders, but the fundamental reality remains unchanged. A rigid, inflexible naval doctrine will always shatter when it collides with the decentralized, highly trained, and technologically superior American war machine. The American logistics chain guarantees that the Nimitz has enough aviation fuel and ordnance in its magazines to cycle these strike packages all day and all night, relentlessly pounding the surviving Soviet escorts until the ocean is clear of hostile contacts. The surface fleet is burning, the backfire bombers are falling from the sky, and the immediate tactical victory is secured. But sinking the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet and annihilating a Guards aviation regiment is not the end of the conflict. It is merely the opening act of a much larger and far more dangerous escalation. The carrier strike group must now transition from fleet defense to power projection, pushing the offensive directly into the teeth of the Soviet mainland defenses, where the real test of American naval dominance is waiting in the dark. The surviving elements of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet are now scattered, burning, or sinking into the cold depths of the eastern Mediterranean. But a United States carrier strike group does not simply win a defensive engagement and sail away. The American naval doctrine of 1982 dictates that once the enemy's offensive capability is blunted, you immediately transition to overwhelming power projection, striking the enemy at their source. For the USS Nimitz and Carrier Air Wing 8, that source is the Crimean Peninsula, the heavily fortified nerve center of Soviet naval aviation and the home ports of the Black Sea Fleet. To understand the sheer audacity of what the US Navy is about to do, you have to look at the tactical and strategic lessons forged in the fires of the Pacific during World War II. In February of 1944, the United States Navy launched Operation Hailstone, a massive carrier strike against the supposedly impregnable Japanese naval anchorage at Truk Lagoon. The Japanese believed their land-based air power and coastal defenses made Truk a fortress. But American carrier aviation systematically dismantled it, sinking cruisers, destroyers, and merchant ships, while obliterating hundreds of aircraft on the ground. In 1982, the target is not a tropical atoll, but the Soviet fortress of Sevastopol and the bomber bases at Saki and Gvardeyskoye, protected by a dense, overlapping network of SA-3, SA-5, and SA-10 surface-to-air missile batteries. How does a carrier air wing crack open one of the most heavily defended airspaces on the planet? You do not fight the missiles, you blind the radar network that guides them. The vanguard of this offensive push is not a fighter or a bomber, but the EA-6B Prowler, a four-seat electronic warfare aircraft that is arguably the most valuable asset on the flight deck. Flying ahead of the main strike package, the Prowler crews utilize their ALQ-99 tactical jamming system, an incredibly sophisticated suite of receivers and transmitters that can detect Soviet radar emissions, analyze their frequencies, and blast them with megawatts of directed electronic noise. To the Soviet radar operators sitting in their concrete bunkers in the Crimea, their green cathode ray screens suddenly fill with blinding strobe lines and false targets, making it impossible to distinguish an incoming American attack jet from a flock of seagulls. As the Prowlers blind the early warning network, the SEAD package, or suppression of enemy air defenses, moves in for the kill. These are A-7E Corsairs, armed with AGM-45 Shrike and AGM-78 Standard anti-radiation missiles. The American pilots deliberately fly into the threat rings of the Soviet missile batteries, waiting for the desperate Soviet operators to switch their tracking radars to full power. The moment a Soviet fan song or square pair radar emits a continuous wave, the American anti-radiation missiles lock onto the beam and ride it all the way down to the source, detonating their fragmentation warheads directly above the radar dishes and permanently blinding the missile sites. With the door kicked open and the air defenses shattered, the heavy hitters arrive. The A-6E Intruders, utilizing their target recognition and attack multi-sensor, or TRAM system, can see the Soviet runways, fuel farms, and submarine pens in pitch darkness using forward-looking infrared. They do not need daylight, and they do not need clear weather. They dive out of the night sky, releasing strings of Mk-84 2,000-pound unguided bombs and Hawkeye cluster munitions directly onto the tarmac, where the surviving Tu-22M Backfire bombers are desperately trying to refuel and rearm. The explosions walk across the flight lines, turning supersonic bombers into twisted, burning wreckage and igniting massive aviation fuel storage tanks that send columns of fire hundreds of feet into the air. This devastating strike highlights the fundamental fatal flaw in the Soviet military machine: their rigid, centralized command structure. The Soviet doctrine relied entirely on shore-based commanders feeding precise data to their ships and aircraft via vulnerable communication links. Once the American electronic warfare aircraft severed those links, and once the American bombs destroyed the physical command bunkers, the surviving Soviet forces were left paralyzed. A Soviet frigate captain or a bomber pilot was not trained to take the initiative. They were trained to wait for orders from Moscow or Sevastopol. Contrast this with the American composite warfare commander concept, where decision-making is pushed down to the lowest possible level. If an American cruiser captain loses contact with the carrier Admiral, he already knows the commander's intent and has the absolute authority to continue prosecuting the battle, launching missiles, and directing fighters independently. This decentralized, highly aggressive mindset is the true asymmetric advantage of the United States military, ensuring that the war machine continues to function even in the chaos and friction of combat. But firepower and tactics are only the sharp edge of the sword. The heavy, crushing weight behind that swing is American logistics. Amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics, and in 1982, the United States Navy possessed a logistical train that no other nation on Earth could even comprehend, let alone match. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet was a short-legged force designed to sprint out of port, fire its missiles, and return home to rearm, a process that could take days or even weeks. The American carrier strike group never has to go home. Steaming just over the horizon is the Sacramento-class fast combat support ship, a 53,000-ton floating warehouse that is as vital to the war effort as the aircraft carrier itself. Powered by the exact same steam turbines used in the Iowa-class battleships, the Sacramento can keep pace with the carrier group at 26 knots. In the middle of the night, in rough seas, the supply ship pulls alongside the USS Nimitz, firing shot lines across the water to establish high-line transfer rigs. While the ships steam parallel to each other at 20 knots, separated by only 100 feet of churning water, massive hoses pump thousands of gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel per minute into the carrier's tanks. Simultaneously, heavy pallets of AIM-54 Phoenix missiles, Mk-82 bombs, and dry provisions are slung across the void on steel cables. This process, known as underway replenishment, allows the American strike group to maintain a relentless 24-hour-a-day operational tempo, cycling strike packages endlessly until the enemy is completely eradicated. This logistical dominance is a direct reflection of the broader economic and industrial disparity between the United States and the Soviet Union during the late Cold War. The Soviet Union was fundamentally a massive land-based empire, and their attempt to build a blue water navy to challenge the Americans was bleeding their economy dry. Building a single Slava-class cruiser, or a titanium-hulled Alpha-class submarine, required a staggering percentage of their gross domestic product, pulling resources away from their domestic infrastructure and consumer goods. The United States, on the other hand, was an economic juggernaut, fueled by a booming capitalist system that could easily absorb the cost of the Reagan administration's massive defense buildup. The American defense industrial base could churn out Nimitz-class supercarriers, Los Angeles-class submarines, and thousands of advanced jet fighters without breaking a sweat. This dynamic is eerily similar to the American Civil War, where the Agrarian Confederacy won several brilliant tactical victories early on, but was ultimately ground into dust by the overwhelming industrial might, railroad networks, and endless logistical reserves of the industrialized Union. In a prolonged conventional conflict in 1982, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet might manage to sink an American escort or shoot down a dozen aircraft, but they could never replace their losses. Every Soviet ship that slips beneath the waves is gone forever, while the United States Navy has the industrial capacity to surge replacement squadrons, fresh munitions, and entire reserve fleets across the Atlantic. Furthermore, the intelligence war heavily favored the United States. The Soviet Union relied heavily on radar-equipped maritime patrol aircraft and a handful of space-based radar satellites to find the American carriers. But the US Navy owned the acoustic spectrum. The Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, was a network of highly classified hydrophone arrays laid across the ocean floor, capable of tracking Soviet submarines from hundreds of miles away. Before a Soviet Tango-class submarine even left the Dardanelles, American intelligence analysts sitting in concrete bunkers in Italy or the United Kingdom were already plotting its course, vectoring P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft to drop sonobuoys directly on top of it. The United States also utilized RC-135 rivet joint aircraft and advanced signals intelligence satellites to vacuum up Soviet electronic communications. We knew their doctrine, we knew their launch codes, and we knew the exact frequencies of their radars. The battle was mathematically decided before the first missile left its launch tube. The Soviet doctrine of the massive, synchronized missile strike was a terrifying concept on paper, designed to overwhelm the senses and defenses of an American fleet. But war is not fought on paper. It is fought in the chaotic, friction-filled environment of the real world, where complex, rigid plans shatter upon first contact with a flexible, highly trained adversary. The United States Navy in 1982 was not a static target waiting to be hit. It was a dynamic, lethal organism armed with the most advanced interceptor aircraft in history, protected by layers of radar-guided missiles and autonomous gun systems, and backed by a damage control culture that simply refused to let ships die. If the Soviet Black Sea Fleet had attempted to execute its battle plan in the eastern Mediterranean, it would have resulted in the total annihilation of Soviet naval power in the region. The American Carrier Strike Group would have absorbed the initial blow, leveraged its superior electronic warfare and decentralized command structure to blind the enemy, and then unleashed a relentless, logistically sustained counterattack that would not stop until the Soviet bases in the Crimea were reduced to smoking craters. The ultimate lesson of this scenario is that true maritime dominance is not just about having the biggest missile or the fastest bomber. It is about the integration of technology, the flexibility of the human operator, the uncompromising efficiency of the logistics chain, and the economic engine that powers it all. The sea belongs to those who can supply it, defend it, and project power from it without relying on a tether to the shore. Which factor do you believe would be the absolute most critical advantage for the US Navy in a 1982 naval conflict? A. The long-range interception capability of the F-14 Tomcat and Phoenix missile. B. The endless logistical support of underway replenishment ships. C. The decentralized, highly flexible composite warfare commander doctrine. Let us know your choice and your reasoning in the comments below.